thanks for sticking with us for the last couple of days. Really appreciate your time and participation. We have one more presentation today. And I know it may seem to lack some continuity with some of the topics that we've discussed so far, but in reality, what we've gone over the last couple of days in order to implement those visions and get more trees and urban forestry moving in California, there is that common denominator of cash, bones, scoot, clams, didge, Benjamins, money. And so that's what we're going to be talking about here. And we've got a great panel that's going to go in a slightly different direction than what we're used to on these retreats. One is you're going to notice that we're going to be talking a bit about federal funds, which is typically something we have not had the opportunity to discuss, at least over the last 4 or 5 years. And we're really pleased to have Joel Pannell with us. He's the Vice President of Urban Forest Policy for American Forests. And I will be distributing via the chat a one-pager from him. After we hear from my colleague and partner in advocacy, Mariela Ruacho, who's going to have a brief presentation and talk about what's happening at the state. So before we begin, I did want to just really acknowledge all the participation of the network members, the grantees, the partners in California ReLeaf over these years and over this year in responding to our action alerts, our legislative alerts. These are so valuable. You'll see in Mariela's presentation the impact they have, but it's so important in our efforts for advocating for funds for urban forestry and related urban green infrastructure that assembly members and state senators see their local urban forestry groups and their local community benefit organizations chiming in and making this request in concert with others for funding in urban forestry. So I just wanted to really acknowledge that, and hats off to all of you for that. And with that, hopefully I have share screen and I'll be able to turn it over to Mariela. So give me just a moment here. Oh, and I just want one. Okay, so Mariela, I believe you're on.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. Again, I am Mariela Ruacho with California ReLeaf, and I'm going to discuss some of our funding opportunities at the state level. So this year, the governor proposed an early action wildfire packet, which included $10 million for urban forestry, which we supported, as you can see from the letter here. The funds were approved in April and money came from the general fund. Now, this is important because that's the largest allocation for the program from general funds, and which also expands grant making opportunities beyond GGRF and bond restrictions, which we heard John early this morning talk about those restrictions and how they plan to roll out the funds hopefully next week. So check out CAL FIRE's website for grant guidelines and application. Next slide. So ReLeaf has been working on these bonds for a while, although this year has been a little bit different because we have been working with the Just Recovery Network. So we had conversation with both sides of both the Assembly and Senate authors on the bond, and found conversations on the Assembly side to be more fruitful than the Senate side, which can be reflected in when it comes to the dollar amounts that were allocated to the urban forestry and urban greening program. The Senate bond has $25 million for urban forestry and $50 million for urban greening. Typically, bonds are supposed to be multi-year allocations, but currently at the current levels, the urban forestry has a 1-year allocation, and the urban greening program has potentially 2-year allocation, depending on how CNRA decides to roll out the program. In comparison,
data is showing that parents will make decisions about their kids getting
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. In comparison, the Assembly bond has 75 million for urban forestry, which is the most funding we have seen for the program, and 100 million for urban greening. Because conversations have gone better on the Assembly side, a small win for the Just Recovery Network has been the inclusion of an extreme heat chapter. Included it has funding for urban forestry and urban greening, and some equity-focused climate investments our partners at the Just Recovery Network are pushing for. We do want to continue pushing to increase those dollar amounts though, which is why we submitted a letter of support if amended as seen here. And many of you supported that letter. So now the big question is, will a bond go through this year? So most likely no, because there is a large surplus that the governor and legislators were not expecting during our most rough time during this pandemic. But when conversations about the bond or a bond come up, we have a good starting point versus what we have received in the past, such as the park bond, which only had 15 million for urban forestry. You can move forward. Next slide. So now I'll go over some budget updates, including the surplus. So earlier this year, we went from a $20 billion projected windfall to Monday when we heard the governor say that there's a $75 billion surplus, which is great news. Now that we know this, legislators are looking to see how we can take advantage of these funds and provide multi-year climate investments to help meet our various climate goals and boost the economy, potentially without having to pass a bond and incur debt this year. So to let you know what California ReLeaf has done, with the Just Recovery Network, we submitted a letter to the governor's office outlining our recommendations for equitable climate investments. That's the letter on the left with a pin and green lining at the top. This letter included 200 million for urban forestry and another 200 million for urban greening, alongside other priorities from our EJ partners. We hope to see that included in the May revise. As larger surplus dollars were being reported, we also worked with our natural resources partners on a $10 billion request for natural resources. This is the letter on the right, which has about 110 organizations in support. If you sign on to the letter, see if you can spot your logo. This is what we call the NASCAR letters, just FYI. Also on Monday, the Senate came out with their budget proposal, which included $15 million annually for over a 5-year span, which is a total of 75 million for urban forestry. This is an okay amount because we know that the program can spend more than that on an annual basis, which is why we want to be more ambitious and push for larger dollar amounts. Lastly, now we are waiting to see what the Assembly comes out in terms of their budget proposal and seeing what's on the May revise, which comes out this Friday. And that's all I have for you right now. Now I'll turn it over to Joel.
Thanks, Mariela. So I'm going to quickly just run through the federal perspective. Can everyone hear me? Okay, yeah, I'm getting another note to unmute myself. Quickly run through the federal perspective and some opportunities and challenges that we're seeing at the DC level. Watching Mariela's presentation, it striking me that a state like California is proposing to dedicate more money for their own urban and community forestry program than the federal urban and community forestry program has at this time. So I think this is definitely an area where California is leading the way, and hopefully a lot of the work that you all are doing at the state level is going to trickle up to the federal level, especially since our vice president obviously is the former senator from the great state of California. So I think right now in DC, the name of the game that everybody's trying to get on is trying to be included in this next large spending package. If we're going to call it infrastructure, build back better, American Job Plan. We'll see what the final number ends up being, but $2 trillion or somewhere in that ballpark is what is being talked about. And so in the Senate, they're going to have to move that through reconciliation, which basically means it's got to adhere to certain rules. And you really cannot create a new program. You've got to do this funding through an existing mechanism or an existing structure. And so at the federal level, the Urban Community Forestry Program really is the only dedicated program, but as we know, there's several other different buckets of federal money that represent green infrastructure. And all of the conversations right now are how can you elevate your interest in your program as part of those larger components in the infrastructure package. And so we are doing that at American Forest. We have several partner organizations that we are working with, many that you all are familiar with, the Trucks for Public Land, which I used to work. And we're really just trying, there's not a lot of details right now, but we're trying to ensure working through the committee, so working through the Senate Agriculture Committee, working through House Natural Resources and the House Agriculture Committee to make sure that every opportunity we have to include urban forestry or funding, buckets of funding that could be used for urban forestry at the state and local level are included in that package. And so I think the good news is that, again, we have an administration that has, from the very beginning, been very vocal and visible on their 4 priorities. And I really feel that urban forestry fits really in all of those, but specifically in 2. So, COVID relief, climate change, racial and economic justice, and then economic growth. And so obviously in climate change and racial equity through American Forest is heavily invested in tree equity and making sure that we address the issue that if you look at a tree canopy cover of almost any major city in America, it's also a map of income and race. And so we really see addressing urban forestry through an equity lens as well. And so that really speaks to all the priorities that this current administration has been very vocal and visible and upfront on. And so, again, I think we're positioned really well. My former life before coming to American Forest was really working on urban parks. I worked with Kamala Harris when she was a senator of California. She introduced the Outdoors for All Act, which really is about more federal investment in LWCF Urban Grant Program. That's another area where California, I think, really has been out in front and has already dedicated money to urban parks and access. And so that bill really had a California lens, not only in the Senate with Kamala Harris, but also Representative Barragan of Southern California is the one who introduced that in the House. And so as far as parks are concerned, there's also a Parks, Jobs, and Equity Act that Representative Barragan is going to be introducing. Senator Padilla, I believe, is likely to introduce that in the Senate, and that's to get $500 million for urban parks program as part of this larger infrastructure package that I'm talking about. So that's all related to parks, but I think there's opportunities there to really tie urban forestry to a larger narrative on the need for increased access to public lands and all the benefits that we know that urban forestry brings to bear, that trees bring to bear in cities. And so another thing that the administration is doing is they released last week, many of you may have seen this America the Beautiful plan. And so the administration is touting that as like the first ever national conservation goal. So it includes the 30 by 30 metrics, but it also includes a lot of language around addressing what they see as the 3 biggest threats to our public lands. And that's the loss of nature to development. And so that's obviously related to forestry, climate change, and inequitable access. So again, all of these things I think really align with the goals that we're looking at from an urban forestry perspective at a national and federal level. And so aside from this large infrastructure package, that the latest I'm hearing, and as a federal lobbyist, my guess is often as good as a piece of paper. So the latest we're hearing is that the timeline on that is a little bit shifted a little bit later. So, people were talking midsummer. Now I think we're looking at August, September. Again, it's going to be very dependent upon what can move through the Senate, where we have a 50-50 split. And Republicans have already come out and signaled that they see infrastructure as being bridges, roads, and ports. And to the extent that green infrastructure is a part of that, that remains to be seen. So Senator Manchin from West Virginia will continue to play an outsized role given the 50-50 nature of the Senate. But those of us working at a federal policy level are really invested in making sure that urban forestry is included and green infrastructure is included in this large package. And so aside from that, we're looking at appropriations. California ReLeaf and several other organizations have sent letters to both the House and Senate asking for $80 million for the federal urban forestry program. Again, when I look at what California is proposing for their state program, that is almost laughable to me, 80 million across the country, but that is the number we're working with. Last year, the program was funded federally at 40 million, which was an increase of the previous year, was at 32 million. And that 8 million really was for, to help localities address the emerald ash borer threat of invasive species. And so we have made the request to not only administration, but to Congress that if you were willing to add 8 million to the program to address an invasive species threat, you really should look at adding, another 40 million just so that we can address equity and do this sort of cost share, tree planting, tree protection investments that municipalities need. So appropriations is one thing. We also do have several other standalone bills right now that really signal unprecedented investment in urban forestry. So you have the Climate Stewardship Act, which was reintroduced a few weeks ago by Senator Booker from New Jersey in the Senate. In the House, it was Representative Spanberger, who's from my hometown area in Virginia. That would create a Reforest America grant program. The amount of, it doesn't specify an amount of money, but it does signal resources necessary to plant 100 million trees in urban areas over the next decade. And so depending on what math you use, we're talking about billions of dollars. American Forest worked with Dr. David Nowak, who I'm sure many of you know, with the U.S. Forest Service, and his report that was released last month basically said that we need, just to keep up with the loss of trees and to have a 10% more tree canopy growth in cities across the country, we need to be planting about 31 million trees a year. And so depending again on what numbers you use, that's about $8.9 billion a year. So we really know that the size of investment needed at the federal level needs to be billions and billions of dollars. And so we're working to get to that. Whether or not we're able to get there, we certainly, if they came back to us and said we can come up with 500 million in a federal stimulus package for urban forestry, we certainly would take that. And so in addition to the Climate Stewardship Act, there's several different iterations of the 21st Century Conservation Corps Act. The one I've looked at most closely is introduced by Senator Wyden and Representative Neguse in the House. That would provide an extra 100 million to the urban community forestry program and provide additional funding to plant about 95 to 100 million trees in urban neighborhoods over the next decade. Other two pieces of legislation that have not been introduced yet this Congress that we're really looking at are the Tree Act, which was introduced previously. Another California representative, Mrs. Matsui, is leading that bill. That would create a program at the Department of Energy for tree planting in urban neighborhoods for energy conservation in residential areas. And then there's also an urban workforce bill that will probably be introduced within the next month. Senator Stabenow, who chairs the Senate Agriculture Committee, is the lead on that in the Senate. And Representative McKeechin, again from Virginia, is the lead on that in the House. And that's really to create an incubator urban workforestry program. And so those, again, are standalone bills that we would hope to move as part of any larger package, whether that's an infrastructure package or if it's creating a new program, probably could not be done through reconciliation, but we would be trying to do that in some other larger package that's going to move either through the Agriculture Committee or through a public lands package. And so that's sort of the lay of the land on where things sit at the federal level. I think, those are opportunities. Those are good opportunities. Some of the challenges that I'm seeing, I've been at American Forest less than 2 months now. So again, I'm an urban parks guy who is learning as fast as I can to become an urban forest guy. And one of the challenges I'm seeing, I just got off a call with the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who is leading I think nationally at a municipal level and a lot of the different things that they're doing to invest in urban forestry. And a challenge is that a lot of times, we all know the benefits of trees and what they bring to cities, to states, to the country. But often at the municipal level, they are managed as a liability. And so if we're going to the federal government, it's a hard argument to make that, hey, we need federal investment to help municipalities maintain their trees, because that is not necessarily a winning argument at the federal level. And so one of the things we're doing at American Forest is really reframing that argument, because the data is on our side, the anecdotal stories are on our side about all the benefits that trees and urban forestry bring. And so just changing the narrative a little bit. So rather than talking about it as maintenance, we talk about it as long-term protection and care, and what municipalities need at the local level and at the state level to maintain healthy, resilient urban forestry systems. And so we're trying to just flip that narrative. I agree. I think I just saw a comment about that being ridiculous. I agree that it's ridiculous, but it's also sort of, how the game is played at the federal level and what we have to do in sense. I think in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of revenue sharing, and the federal government was helping municipalities and local levels with these sort of things. When the Reagan administration and others came in and really cut back that federal funding, we're not seeing that level of investment for that. And so there are programs like the Community Development Block Grant Program. There's programs through DOT, there's programs through HUD, through HHS, where we can align urban forestry with some of these other, transportation, housing, and health needs, because we're really focused on health, jobs, and equity. But we're going to have to do the work to make sure that those federal funding buckets are available, and that at the local and state level that we are encouraging folks in mayor's offices and governor's office to allow for those programs to fund not just tree planting and maintenance, but all of the things that go into sustainable, healthy urban forest systems. So with that, I'll stop talking, and I don't know how much time we have and what we're going to do for questions, but I'll turn it back over to you, Mariela, and happy to address any questions that folks have.
Well, thank you both very much for taking the time to run through some of those opportunities. Definitely, in my time in urban forestry, this is unprecedented. The dollar amounts we're talking about, the opportunities, the variety of programs that may become available. We've had a lot of spirited discussion in the chat. I will probably need to rely on some of my staff to help me get to some of these questions. But I have a question that I want to pose to each of you, and then a question for both of you. I think we have enough time to do this. So I'm going to start with you, Joel. Obviously, the president's term is for the next 4 years, but with midterm elections now realistically about a year and a half away, can you prognosticate to the best extent possible really what our timeline is to try to achieve some of these transformative changes at the federal level, given the tight margin of representation in both the House and Senate?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chuck. I think this is probably going to be the last major spending package we're going to see for a while, this next iteration that I was talking about. And so I don't want to say we need to put all of our it's the afternoon here on the East Coast, and I need more caffeine. I'm forgetting my mantras and cliches, but all our eggs in one basket or what have you. I don't want to say that, but I do think that is really the big, if we're going to see significant investment in urban forestry at the federal level, that's sort of our one big opportunity. And ramping up through the summer and getting the voices of mayors and community-based organizations and others at the local and state level, making that drumbeat at the federal level to everybody that will listen, I think is really, really important, because we don't want to miss our shot at this opportunity. Beyond that, with such a divided Congress, it's going to be really, really challenging to get anything that has a price tag tied to it. And there's going to be, trees, I think, are a bipartisan issue. We have seen this Trillion Trees Act introduced by Republican, the ranking member of the House Agriculture Committee, Mr. Westerman from Arkansas. In terms of urban, there's some good things in there about urban wood and other things, but their idea of funding urban, I think, is like, $1 million to $5 million a year for like a Tree City program or something like that. So it's just not at the scale that's going to move the needle or make an impact. That said, trees are in urban forestry can and should be a bipartisan issue. So I think the best way to maybe long way of answering your question is that we really need to focus on this big spending package that's going to come out later this year. And then beyond that, I think it's going to be looking at some of those other federal programs through appropriations that I was talking about. I don't see a big public land package moving again. The Great American Doors Act passed, under the last administration, which was great for parks, but I'm not sure how great it was for urban forestry. And so I think we're really going to need to peel back and look at some of these existing buckets of federal money, and that's going to be where the play is over the next two, heading into the 2022 election cycle, and then hopefully we'll get another shot at a big spending measure after that.
Great, thank you. Really informative. Mariela, in your presentation, you mentioned a few times our partnership with the Just Recovery Network. For folks that may not know what that is, do you want to take just a minute to explain what that is?
Yeah, no problem. So the Just Recovery Network is a group of California ReLeaf and 2 other environmental justice partners that we have been working with, which is APEN and Green Lining, the Green Lining Institute. So we've been working on seeing like how can we recover from COVID and help communities not only recover from COVID, but be more resilient and adaptable to climate change impacts. As you know, EJ communities, disadvantaged and low-income communities, just trying to use the California definitions, tend to lack not only tree canopy, there's many pollutants. So making sure that we are advocating for not only policy to improve those communities, but also funding to EJ programs that help really drive changes in those communities, such as urban forestry, urban greening, but some of the other ones are like the low-income weatherization program and the transformative climate community program, just to name a few. And also the Just Recovery Network really came together during when the governor announced their economic task force. We submitted multiple letters to the task force on some of the issues that we want to see improved for EJ communities. For instance, we submitted some recommendations for the Office of Racial Equity, which there's a bill going out right now from sponsored by the Green Lining Institute. And then there's another bill by APEN for resiliency hub centers. So yeah, just to name a few things.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, I see we do have some questions in the chat, and I'll rely on Sarah and Amelia to help me here if I miss any. I know one of them was, there was a question regarding opportunities for fiscal support around preservation. I don't know if that was at the state or federal level, but Joel, I think that question came in while you were talking. So do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Joe, could you repeat that real quickly?
Funding opportunities for preservation or conservation of lands.
Yeah, so there's a lot. I think that the administration just announced the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program, which is the LWCF Urban Grant Program I was talking about, that then Senator Harris introduced and Representative Barragan, both from California. And so that they just announced that there's 150 million available in this current round. There are some rules I know that has funded public lands projects in California. Specifically, the way that it works now is that each state, I believe, can submit up to 4 projects to National Park Service, at which point it becomes a federally competitive program. Now that they have a larger bucket of money, I think the hope is that they will allow states to submit more. A state like California could obviously submit many projects. There are other states that have far less urban areas. You have to be a 50,000 community of 50,000 and defined by the census as an urbanized area to apply for this program. So that's one bucket. We know with the Land and Water Conservation Fund in general, and the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, that has now been permanently funded at $900 million a year. So that has lots of funding opportunities for preservation of land and public lands. You know, the Forest Legacy Program is under that. And so there's, you know, just within the Department of Interior, there's several different programs. The Department of Agriculture and the Forest Service has some other funding programs as well. But I think one of the things that I'm really focused on is how we can look at everything that was passed in the Great American Outdoors Act and that bucket of money that's almost, you know, almost $1 billion a year, how we can use that for more urban forestry related things, because it's for public lands. And I know also that a lot of our urban forestry needs are on the private land side. And so how we can align that is something that we're really focused on as well. So there are large buckets of money, I think, on the public land conservation side that we can tap into.
Thanks, Joel. I'm seeing from one of my colleagues that we should be wrapping up, but I do have one more question from Mariela. So this will be the last question. I know there's more questions we have time for, but I think we are having a lunch after this. So there may be more opportunities to field those. I know Mariela will still be around. Joel, obviously you're welcome to join us. Mariela, the last question to you is, you know, Joel mentioned what CBOs, mayors, local governments can be doing to help drive the initiative at the federal level. What can folks on this call, CBOs, local governments, be doing to help drive some of the state initiatives that you referenced?
Yeah, so this week the governor has been rolling out multiple expenditures. For instance, yesterday he rolled out his expenditure plan for schools. He might be talking about natural resources right now. We don't know, but California ReLeaf did put a letter together making to respond to the May revise, hopefully asking, in that letter, we're asking for $200 million for the urban forestry program and $200 million for the urban greening program, which is a request of $400 million and for both programs. And again, these are like multi-year funding requests. It's not just for 1 year. So we want to be ambitious and bold right now that there is a large enough surplus that we can really have equitable climate investments, and then that way we don't need to incur any debt from any bond that we pass, and then just have multi-year funding. And I'll be sending out hopefully an email to everyone tomorrow asking for your support on that letter.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you both to our presenters. It was a really robust discussion. It seems like there was a lot of passion around this subject based on what I saw in the chat. And maybe this conversation will continue during its lunchtime. But I'm going to turn this back over to final thoughts from our executive director. And thank you again for joining.